Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting just a minute or two for people to log on. But nice to see some familiar names. Give it one more minute and then make a start. Okay, I'm going to kick off. Welcome everybody that's attending, and welcome to everyone who watches this back, as I know often with Building Better members, that is often the case. Thanks very much for coming today. I'm really looking forward to hearing this presentation myself. The reason for this session really came about during a board meeting. Seya Tansel, who I'll introduce in a bit more detail in a couple of minutes, is one of the directors of Building Better. And we had a great session around what it means to try and achieve net zero, what the different definitions mean. And it just became very clear that there is a lot of gray area and misunderstanding when it comes to both the definitions and then how one might specify for net zero. And so the other directors on the board said, say it would be great if this is something that you could offer to our teams and other colleagues in the sector. And Seya has kindly obliged. So the idea behind today's session is to look at the difference between operational and embodied carbon, get a bit more understanding with definitions. I think this is something that some of you may well know, but hopefully will still be useful to revise. The gap specifically between the ask and outcomes, and then some of the risks associated with specifying for net zero when it comes to manufacturers and contractors as well. I'll quickly introduce Seya. I don't know if she'll have anything else to say, but she's worked in the private sector before she joined the BRE, where she was offsite construction lead. She's now gone back into the private sector, and she's currently with a tier one contractor, Bomer and Kirkland, where she is senior design and innovation lead. The presentation should last for about 30 to 40 minutes. We're recording, so the slides will be available afterwards alongside everything that Seya is saying. And there'll hopefully be a bit of time for question and answers at the end. If you can use either the chat or the question and answer tab at the bottom of the Zoom box to ask a question. I can pass that on to Seya, and I might have a couple of questions myself. I think that's everything, and I'll hand over to you, Seya.
Thank you, Trina. Yeah, no, that's a great introduction. Thank you very much. So as Trina said, I now work for a main contractor, which has opened my eyes or provided a bit of a different lens on the area of net zero carbon, the risks we should be considering around that. And as part of my role, I work very closely with public sector clients, understanding their needs as well as private sector clients, to make sure that we have really transparent conversation around what they're trying to get out of the net zero carbon ask, and how to do it in a diligent way and a way that is going to be of use to them in their armory in the future in terms of data. So you can see by the opening slide really that is, no one really has the answer at the moment. So we're at a point in time, there's certain sectors that are ahead of this than others. And really I'm trying to provide my experience in other spaces to understand where we're at the moment, some watch points around specifying net zero carbon so that you get the best outcome from your briefs and your employer's requirements, and then some of the risks that are perceived around that. So, I've got the whirring. There we go. So to start with, just to align terminology through the presentation so you understand where we are. As a reminder, operational carbon is everything, all the energy essentially that is used to fuel your home. When we talk around that from a whole life carbon perspective, that is described as stage B. That's exactly the same thing. And then just for absolute clarity, operational carbon is not a net zero carbon criteria. So operational net zero carbon is the balance of the energy used against the amount of energy generated by the building to reach the 0 point. And the different things which, again, I'll come on to. Embodied carbon, which I will touch on at the end of this presentation, but as I understand in housing, it's not as predominant as it is in other sectors. But just for clarity of terminology, again, upfront carbon or embodied carbon is from raw extraction of the material right at the end to practical completion when a contractor hands over the building to yourselves. And from a whole life carbon perspective, there's stages C and D. C is the amount of energy used during the building's lifespan to replace and maintain products. And D is a circularity perspective. So is it recyclable? Does it get reused? So just a reminder on those. Okay, to kick off, when you ask for an operational net zero carbon building, that could mean a number of things. Surprisingly, there is no consistent definition of what net zero carbon is. When I worked at BRE at that point in time, there was 9 different definitions out there that you could use for specification. So just putting operational net zero carbon into your briefs is not enough to be able to really define what you're going to get as an outcome at the end. So the first thing to do is, what is the definition of net zero carbon are we going to use? The most common one is the Green Building Council's definition, which is in the report shown on the right and abbreviated to the left. This is used commonly across the industry. It was the first one that came out and is probably the one that is easiest to understand and is probably recognised the most. But within that definition, you can see on screen that there's a few points there that I've highlighted that from a contractual perspective could be argued in a number of ways in terms of what is highly energy efficient and how do you get there. What is a renewable energy resource, and offsetting and carbon balance is also quite a contentious issue in the industry. So touching on those points in more detail as definition watch points would be really good to elaborate when you're setting your ER requirement for net zero carbon. Highly energy efficient, I would presume that's fabric first. Surely that's fabric first with an efficient service design after it, because that's what the industry has been banging on about for a long time. However, with the development of grid decarbonisation and schemes, I won't name them, but certain energy providers providing schemes where they will just offset all the energy with green energy from the grid, that isn't necessarily taken for granted anymore. So by referring to the Green Building Council's definition, you do inherently say that you're looking for fabric first approach, because lower down in that document, it provides a hierarchy of fabric first services, renewable technology, and then offsetting. But to be absolutely clear, I would certainly prescribe how you want the highly energy efficient part of that definition to be achieved. Watch point number 2 is the renewable energy sources. So this is what I've just touched on. And as a company, I think it's definitely worth a discussion of how you want to treat grid decarbonisation moving forward, because this is going to get more and more of a contentious issue as more of the grid gets decarbonised. However, in theory, at the current point, I think we're about 43% decarbonised by the BEIS figures. on the grid. So technically 40% of the energy that is coming into any home is sourced from renewable energy source. Do you want to capture that as part of the definition to say, okay, well, only 60% of the energy used we need to balance out with the renewable energy sources, and that will get us to zero? Or do you want to make them do the full 100%? And that is, it's only something that your company can really decide on. As that gets a higher value, obviously you'd have to probably look at that specification again. But without putting that into your employer's requirements as a specification, someone could potentially use that and be getting a 40% advantage on their calculations over someone else, and therefore you're not getting a like for like between your projects. So clarity on that's really important. Offsetting, again, it's a similar watch point as I previously said. It has to be a company discussion and a company decision of how you want to treat it. The DFE, as a public sector body, and the DIO and basically the public sector have said that they want to use the Green Building Council's definition of net zero carbon, but without the ability to offset. It's an easy out really for a lot of contractors. Carbon credits are cheap. Unverified carbon credits are even cheaper, and it's easier for them to offset at the moment than it is to actually provide you a net zero carbon building at handover, which is sad, and it also doesn't cover carbon in perpetuity. So it's a one-off payment essentially. Again, something you need to think about, but you certainly need to write into your definition if you don't want the majority of the energy being bought through offsets, then it needs to be clarified in the employer's requirements. The other really key point is specifying that you want to have an operational net zero carbon building at handover. And this goes back to the grid decarbonisation factor. So if you don't specify at handover, an argument could be made towards the roadmap of grid decarbonisation to get you to net zero carbon at a point in time, which might be fine for your needs of your project. But if you don't want that, please make sure you put at handover in your employer's requirements or in your net zero carbon definition. What energy will you be measuring? So regulated and unregulated energy. Regulated is mandatory. That's what we were talking about. What powers your home for your ventilation, heating, lighting, etc. That's an easy one to hit. Outside of housing, unregulated energy is generally also included within the operational energy measurement of a building. Reason being is because we use TM54 calculations, which I'll come on to in a minute. But also because there's a clear definition of inclusions and exclusions of what is allowed for in the unregulated energy, which is easier to do when you've got an office building which opens at 8 and closes at 5, or a school, for instance. Obviously, you've got 24-hour continuous running of unregulated energy with someone leaving the TV on at home and boils the kettle 20 times a day, which is more difficult within our sector, within the housing sector. But it would be, it's a big gap that isn't being looked at or isn't being calculated at the moment. So if you're wanting to really truly look at offering a net zero carbon home, some benchmarks around unregulated energy really need to be drawn, either as an industry standard or at a company level, where all we really have to do is make sure the metering, for unregulated and regulated energy is split apart, and you can start collecting data on that to draw some benchmarks. So an interesting development there for housing on how we treat metering moving forward to make sure we can get some unregulated energy balanced off with the renewables in future. Okay, so that's your definition watch points. This is what you should be writing in of what net zero carbon is, and for your employees' requirements, but you also have to think about, so how are we going to get there? So I don't know how you are currently asking for net zero carbon as part of your specifications. I've seen the ones on screen a number of times. Unfortunately, though, none of these are actually a net zero carbon specification. So SAP score above 100, SBEM, BAR, minus BAR, TAR, or I've even seen BREEAM Excellent used as a verification or proof of performance for net zero carbon. Unfortunately, they are just compliance verifications only, unless they're used as part of the net zero carbon definition that I spoke about above. And this is something that nobody really wants to hear. But as I said, this is a point in time. This is an industry challenge, a sector challenge, I think, actually, for housing. But SAP and SBEM are designed to be national benchmarks. So they're national benchmarks of energy use, which is fantastic, and we absolutely need them for what they do. However, then because they're national benchmarks, everything is averaged. You've got averaged algorithms, and they're not particularly accurate from measuring from an energy perspective to achieve net zero carbon, bearing in mind every little bit of energy that is used in a house is supposed to be offset. So if you're not measuring it properly and really accurately in the first instance, you're never going to get that outcome at the in-use phase. BREEAM, again, I've seen BREEAM Excellent listed as, if you get BREEAM Excellent, will be net zero carbon. Unfortunately, it just doesn't have the level of detail within it to achieve that. So it's not a way that you can properly specify for a net zero carbon building. EUI target, great, we want 30 or 30 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, absolutely fine, but use that within the definition. That is against the Green Building Council definition without offsetting, with offsetting, etc. And that will give you ability to specify net zero carbon. So how should we be measuring TM54? And how should we be measuring the operational carbon aspects? So if we want to do this properly, this is how we would do it. Now, I appreciate that in housing, because of the value of projects, this is more difficult. It puts more cost onto the project. But for large scale developments or for a series of developments, this could be, this is really how we should be calculating the energy, the upfront energy at design stage. So a TM54 calculation, as I looked at before, goes into a lot more detail around what's included in the energy usage of a building and the fabric heat losses and those sort of aspects. And that needs to be accompanied with a HVAC dynamic simulation. The IS Apache HVAC is a certain type. There are others out there, but that's the most commonly used as a dynamic simulation. And this is the really important piece that maps the building against, off-axis data, so future climate scenarios. And that's the really key piece of detailing, coupled with the TM54, which provides you the accuracy of data to be able to predict what that home or what that building is going to be used from an energy uses perspective. And this is really important from, I think, of a value to the client, because if you use SAP or SBEM, it will be designing all of the MEP services to a peak load, whereas this will provide you with a better understanding of what your regular load is and your peak loads are. Because the majority of the times we just put massive plant into large buildings, designing for the peak load. So 97% of the time, the building is running inefficiently with a really large bit of plant designed for 2 days a year, which could be downsized, and you just put a couple of electric boilers in for that peak loading, which this allows you to do much more accurately. So that's a saving from a cost perspective, but massive saving from a carbon perspective as well. And And I've touched on that. So if you have a really conscientious contractor who is wanting to really provide you with a net zero carbon home, and you hand them over a SAP or an SBEM for a large building at tender stage, they shouldn't really be accepting that. They can accept it, but they need to be doing the TM54 and the HVAC calculation with it. I realise it's the industry norm at the moment, but it doesn't mean that it is accurate at the moment. No one wants to hear it, but it's the reality of where we are. Okay, and just building on that, I think net zero carbon at handover is perfectly plausible, and everyone should be able to deliver you that as a client need. As soon as we start talking about can you provide us net zero carbon targets after handover, this is where we get into well, I think quite a really exciting space around data and IoT, and being able to measure what the building is actually doing in use. We've got 1,000 data points in our schools, which feed back all of the information around how the building is used. And that's to protect us, because we're held to net zero carbon requirements post handover, but we need to prove that actually someone was in that room 24 hours a day with that window open. And therefore that's why the net zero carbon metering is skewed. So it's there to protect ourselves, but it should be used as more of a, preventative aspect to say, yep, we've got known benchmarks, we've got a standard data framework, and actually it will be no problem for us to provide you net zero carbon in use, because we know that we've got the monitoring process to be able to do it. The industry isn't there yet, but I think the likes of Building Better and other other players are also looking into the space as how do we standardize that framework to enable us to look at net zero carbon post handover as a contractual requirement. At this point in time, I don't think we're there. So I'm just going to quickly touch on, again, this tender handover, this documentation that we've always provided the same level of detail on for us to then move into construction phase. I think where we have been up to now probably doesn't give us enough detail for us to provide a proper net zero carbon brief and a proper net zero carbon outcome. Reason being, unfortunately, is because of technical support, and I think accuracy of measurement and data. So when we started looking at this, we thought our U values were down at 0.18. So we had a SAP calc given to us, which had 0.18 written in it, a build-up detail, and a SAP calc from Kingspan or Rockwell, whoever it was at the time. When we then actually started properly calculating that panel, we were up at 0.31 by the time you put in all the double studs, the studs around the windows, etc., which was a 40% difference in performance. That 40% would have had to be, that heat would have had to be replaced by our boilers in use, and therefore you start to see where the performance gap is. So verification around your fabric, on the fabric design, early stage, either done by the contractor or time given to the contractor to do that verification at tender, or by the design teams up front, is really important to make sure you're getting the outcomes you need. Air tightness. Every contractor should have a specialist on board, or have a partnered specialist and a champion with them early stage if you're looking at a net zero carbon building. That air tightness strategy should be part of the initial design up front. And I can't stress enough, you cannot start early enough to make sure that that works. So making sure that when you're going out to tender, that's part of your requirements, or questioning around experience and air tightness. It's really important. Thermal bridging, really interesting thought. Obviously within SAP you can use default or accredited details still potentially. This can't be the case if you want a net zero carbon building. It needs to be individually calculated, and either that's part of the upfront tender information, or time needs to be given to the contractor to do that, to be able to actually understand how much heat lost is through thermal bridging. Again, it accounts for between 30 and 40% of the building's heat loss. So really important to make sure that's done up front. And if they want to swap the construction methodology, they need to be doing those all again, which is why they probably wouldn't want to. The last two are just around ventilation strategies and PV generation, which could be picked up with the TM54 in SAP and SBEM. They're not as sensitively calculated, I suppose. So the types of MVHR units down for a 1 or a 0.6 air tightness probably need a bit of vetting in terms of the higher efficiency units are much more expensive and probably aren't picked up in SAP, as you can't really use these for lower air tightness. So just some watch points around that. Again, your SAP assessor should be providing you with that information, but some might not have the experience. And PV generation, again, needs to be part of the early design package, because that's your balancing act in the majority of times. To get to your net zero carbon, you need to make sure that your the panels being used are suitable to do that offset without getting blankets of PV everywhere, which is just not what we want from a future embodied carbon perspective. Okay, so touching really quickly at the end on embodied carbon. I know it's not a focus at the moment from a housing perspective, but it's certainly on people's horizons. So how do you know what's being measured? So that, again, there is no common definition of how embodied carbon should be measured. There's a CIBSE in the BS standard, but it doesn't go into what level of detail you need. And it's really important for clients to make sure they're defining exactly what they want, so that in 10 years' time, we're still not in this position now where we can't draw commonality or consistency of data, because everything's been measured differently, or we don't know how it's been measured, and therefore it's just apples and pears. We can't get to a common base point or benchmark. So the first thing to watch is that, which is surprising, but all the LCA tools for embodied carbon, they look at different carbon databases. So a product in one database could have a completely different carbon value to that of another database. So when you are specifying measurement, you need to say, I want you to either use this tool or this carbon database, so you've got apples with apples every time. What do you want measured? So just saying I want everything measured isn't particularly useful, and just enables gaps in the data, because you never really get a breakdown of what's measured in the overall reports that come from the consultants. So it's much better for that to be broken down per package for what you want. So cladding, structures, externals, which includes fencing, includes drainage and the infrastructure around it. So breaking that down for clarity is much more useful, and you will be able to make sure that you have consistency of measurement across your buildings. Level of detailing to be measured is a really interesting one. Again, no guidance on it, and is totally up for interpretation. So if you asked for, just a cladding package on one project, they could just measure the outer board, but on another one, they measured the outer board and the fixing substrates, which is a massive difference in tonnage of carbon. So again, setting that level of detail is difficult, but is certainly worthwhile. And out of interest, we've done this in the school sector, just as a, what's the actual carbon aspect, and we were looking at containment. Containment is generally just the fixing rods and the basket, and that's how everyone measures it. We included all of the fixings and bolts and the tools used, because you go through however many drill bits, etc. And it ended up being over 70 tons of carbon more in that package than what we would have measured. So in the future, as we get down to that granularity of detail and understanding of carbon in the different packages, this is going to, we'll have a lot more PV, I think, or a lot more offsetting to do when we really understand that carbon. But the benchmark at the moment is not fixings and that sort of thing, just for clarity. And And do you want sequestration included in the calculations? Really important to specify. So that's the carbon locked in by the timber for the lifespan of the building. And is that included in the calculations? Because if it is in one and not in the other, and you've got a timber frame building, that's a significant amount of carbon. I personally feel that it shouldn't be, because you can't guarantee how that timber is going to be disposed of. The majority of it does go to landfill or burnt, unfortunately. So it does really skew the results drastically. But again, that's sort of just a company decision that you have to make. Okay, so that's just some useful documents for you that, if you just get into grips with carbon and really wanting to understand the language and how it's used across the industry, those are some really good documents. That one pager on the right hand side from Letty is a really good starting point. And yeah, that's it. I hope you found that interesting and informative. Are there any questions?
Sarah, thank you so much for that. I'm really amazed by how you were able to cover so much very technical ground in a really accessible way. So yeah, thank you very much for a really interesting and informative presentation. I have a couple of questions just to kick us off, and just a reminder to the others, you're welcome to put any questions in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll pick those up. It came out throughout the presentation a couple of times that our sector is still finding its feet with some of this stuff. And I wondered if you're a housing association or a local authority and you're pretty early on in your journey, you've got some ambitious targets around sustainability, but you're not exactly sure how that translates in terms of net zero, operational, embodied. What might be a good first couple of steps that you might take as an individual in your business?
Yeah, I think it's really nailing down that definition and what you're asking for. So if you have that as this is our single hymn sheet, what we will be asking for every time, everyone in the business, that will put you in such a good stead for anything you do in the future being measured and you being able to compare consistently across your portfolio. Without having that consistent definition, unfortunately, lots of people interpret definitions differently, and you could have a very different outcome on all of your measurements, which just makes it a useless, a waste of money essentially, because it's only for one project and you can't use it as your benchmark. So driving consistency of how you're asking for net zero carbon, I think, is the most important starting point.
Well, one of the things that really came out for me is that also enables you to compare better. Like if you don't have that definition square at the beginning, you're not actually comparing like for like, and therefore costs might be thrown out, or potential partner you want to work with suddenly becomes unviable. Or
yeah, absolutely. And if you're consistent in the ask, you'll find that people will be able to come back to you with more innovation in these spaces because they know exactly what they're aiming for each time. So you get more out of your design teams. You get, much easier ride through the contractual piece because everything's defined, it's set out, and everyone knows where they stand from a risk perspective. So yeah, that's definitely where I'd start.
what would your advice be in terms of finding the right partners and also contractors? Like what would you be looking out for as a sign that they're on the same page as you, and or what might be a good red flag as well?
I would say transparency, actually. So a design team, unless they can, really prove their experience, have their own carbon tools, etc., which a lot of consultants are starting to build themselves now, which is great. We're really seeing the industry move. If someone comes along and said, yeah, absolutely, I can do all of that, no problem, that's what concerns me. But those that are willing to sit down and have a conversation about transparency of how we're going to achieve this, and really want to engage in a conversation with you about how, when, and where, that's where you're most that you're going to get the most support in this, and that's the most valuable, definitely.
Thank you. And I've got a final question, if I can say it. So Building Better's finding its feet with this stuff too. I mean, some of the work that you've been doing alongside Tony at Procurement for Housing, who are supporting us with running this webinar today, is just understanding what some of our manufacturing partners are actually doing and what they're saying they're doing, and if that matches up with what our expectation is. And we've got this new framework launching in the summer, which is specifically aimed at traditional contractors delivering MMC systems within the scheme. Could you say a little bit about how we've approached that, given your involvement with that project?
Yeah, so we've got all the watch points sorted in the definition. So within the framework, we were really clear to make sure, you know, we are against the Green Building Council's definition. We are asking for it at handover. We're not allowing offsetting. We're asking for an EUI target, a primary energy demand target, and those all together as a consistent approach has enabled the traditional contractors to come back with us with some really good data of what they've currently got and where they are, proving through SEP calcs how they're doing it. And it's been really interesting. There's a few that are already there. You can really see, you know, we're just teetering on the edge of being able to get net zero carbon, but we've got a journey to be able to actually get there, and that's absolutely fine, because it's, you know, it hasn't really been a common ask before. So us as Building Better are really assisting the industry, I think, on that journey to be able to do that in a consistent way for housing associations to take benefit from.
Perfect. One very last question. I did say that was the last one, but I have a final question, which is, if anyone watching this feels nervous, they're just like, it's really big, it feels tricky, what would your advice to them be as an individual?
Engage with, you know, people like Building Better. You know, we have you, Trina, do a lot of hard work around supporting housing associations with this. There's some you know, I work with some really good outfits that we could pass on in terms of energy consultants who are really transparent and just say how it is. I would also be very wary of engaging with consultants who really want to push the boundaries and say, no, we're gonna push them past the point of where the industry currently is at, because you just won't get a good outcome from that. We're on a step change process towards true net zero carbon, and, you know, it's one step at a time at the moment.
I think that's really sound advice to end on. I just want to say a thank you now to all of you who are in the room. Massive thank you to Saya for your time and the presentation today. A thank you to Lucinda, who's been in the background doing the organising and setting things up. And one request, please, for those of you on the call, if you could stay on, there's just 2 questions with 3 multiple choice at the end that ask you how helpful you found the session today, and if you'd like to know a little bit more. And that means that we can get some useful feedback to take forward on content like this for in the future as well. Oh, thanks very much, everybody, and hope you have a nice afternoon, rest of day.
Bye.